Hello everybody, welcome back to another video by Jay Bowman. Today it's a bit of a different video for this channel. Normally, as you'll know if you're a frequent watcher, I talk about and play synthesizers on this channel. Today I'm going to be talking about cameras, and in particular these two cameras which I have on the desk with me here. So if you found this video through the search function, then just be aware that this is a bit of a departure from this channel. If you're a regular viewer, then this might be one you want to skip, unless, like me, you happen to have a passion for cameras as well as for synthesizers. So what I wanted to do in this video is talk about my initial impressions of my experience of moving from using the Olympus EM1 Mark III, which I've owned and used extensively for about 5 years now, to the OM System's OM1 Mark II, which I acquired about 3 weeks ago now. So I'm not going to put a huge number of images, if any at all, in this video. I'm not really going to talk too much about image quality because from my initial impressions, the image quality between the two cameras is very, very similar, if not identical. So I'm not going to go into huge detail in image comparisons. I might put one or two up if I get time. What I want to talk about instead is the user experience, really, of moving from one camera to the other. When I was putting in my research into the OM1 Mark II, thinking about whether or not I'd buy it, there's a lot of videos on the OM1 Mark II. There is some information out there about the move or the differences between the EM1 Mark III and the original OM1. But because there was that intervening camera, there's very little on the differences or the experience of moving from the EM1 Mark III to OM System's latest full-body professional camera, which is the OM1 Mark II. So I've skipped a model between these two. So that's what I want to talk about. So that's what this video is going to be about. And I think the main thing I'm going to talk about is the differences in handling, the differences in kind of day-to-day use. So what I use my cameras for is mostly portraits of my family, everyday life, my children particularly. But I also do a bit of wildlife photography, bird photography, macro photography. So that's what I tend to use my cameras for, just to give you a bit of background as to what use these cameras are being put through. And I suppose the other thing I do with my cameras is I film these videos. So what you can't see is that I have a third camera, which is the EM5 Mark III, which is filming this video now. And the EM5 Mark III has essentially exactly the same sensor as the EM1 Mark III. So it was quite useful having two functionally identical cameras in terms of the sensor, the image quality. Obviously the form factor is a bit different. Now I've got these two main cameras and the sensor is different. The image quality is similar. Let's talk about how they feel in the hand. So the EM1 Mark III has always been very comfortable for me. There's a lot I like about this camera. It just feels very nice using it with any lens, really. Let me show you. The lens I use for macro and bird photography here is this old Sigma 4/3 150 macro lens. I have the 2x converter with it, and then an adapter, a 4/3 to micro 4/3, just to show you how that looks on the EM1 Mark III. There we go. For micro 4/3, I'd say this is quite a heavy setup, but it's still quite light and it feels very, very good in the EM1 Mark III. So the OM1 Mark II has a very similar kind of feel and design. I think if you're not a camera geek, you're not going to really notice the differences between these two cameras, or they're not going to be obvious in fact, I'd say my family, who I've been taking pictures of using these two cameras, they've not noticed that I've changed camera, as far as I'm aware. They just look, they look essentially the same. But as I've used them for so much, I can notice all these tiny differences, which is what, you know, someone who uses the camera a lot will notice when they move from one to the other. So let me go through those. So overall, the EM1 Mark III feels a little bit smaller, a little bit lighter, and possibly a little bit more sturdy. Let me go into that. Let's talk about the design of the OM1 Mark II and the differences from this, between this and the EM1 Mark III. So the first thing I'm going to talk about, which is something I like a lot, is they've moved the microphone slot there, the microphone input, which makes it easier to manipulate the screen. I mean, it's still a little bit fiddly, but makes it easier to manipulate the screen while you've got something going into the microphone jack. And I've already used this for video recording, and I've noticed that's a lot better, a lot more convenient. You could kind of do it on the EM1 Mark III, but it was a little bit more painful. You see how that is right in the way there. So you'd have to change the screen out here and then move it back. So that is something they've improved on the OM1 Mark II. And I'll say, as an overall first impression, my general feeling is that they have improved a lot of things on the OM1 Mark II, but quite often what they've done is they've improved it in some way. They've taken like one step forwards and maybe half a step back. But here, that's you know, that's a straightforward improvement. I think the other slots are identical to the EM1 Mark III, so I'm not going to go into those. Let's look at this top left shoulder section here. So on the EM1 Mark III, these buttons have a very short travel. So this is for the drive mode and the autofocus modes. They have a very short travel, but quite a definite click. Now that feeling has changed on the OM1 Mark II. They have a longer travel and they feel mushier. This top left shoulder section here, that's indented. Now I wonder if the reason for those changes is to make this easier to operate with gloves on. I very rarely use my cameras with gloves, so I don't know. I mean, this change is neutral from my perspective because I'm not always using these buttons, so that's fine. The power switch is shorter and stubbier on the OM1 Mark II than the EM1 Mark III. I actually, again, think that it's an improvement on the OM1 Mark II. It just feels chunkier and sturdier to turn it on and off. This on-off switch looks a tiny bit vulnerable. I can see why they did this, because it's a kind of visual nod to the original 1970s OM1, which used this lever to turn on the metering. But there's a little bit of wobble in that lever, and it does, just because it's long and thin, it does look a tiny bit vulnerable. So I think that's a straightforward improvement here on the OM1 Mark II. Now the viewfinder, these two buttons here, you've got menu button and viewfinder button. They are very similar in terms of position and feel. You know, I've been using the EM1 Mark III for 5 years, so these buttons, the springs, have had a lot of use, so it's hard to tell if there's actually a real change between them, so very little to say there. Now the viewfinders, when I first moved from the EM1 Mark III to the OM1 Mark II, the viewfinder is more contrasty, it has a lot more detail. I wasn't sure at first whether I actually preferred the OM1 Mark II or the EM1 Mark III viewfinder, but having used it now for a few weeks, I find it quite difficult actually to go back from the OM1 Mark II viewfinder to the EM1 Mark III. It's a lot better. It's a big improvement, and it does make quite a big difference to the viewing experience. So again, I'd say that is a big step forward. The other thing they say is that on the OM1 Mark II, they've added, I don't know if it's a coating or some special feature to the viewfinder, which makes it harder for this viewfinder to mist up. And that was always a bit of a bugbear for me with the EM1 Mark III. Although it's a weather sealed camera, you know, I take it out and shoot it in the rain. It's quite easy for the viewfinder to mist up. And I actually emailed Olympus about that the first time it happened, because it's quite annoying, really. You start shooting with it and gradually you realize the contrast is getting less and less in the viewfinder until you can barely see anything at all. Then you have to switch to the screen, but you know, if it's pouring with rain, that's not very practical. And then you have to find a way of drying out the condensation in the viewfinder. So if they've solved that, and I should say it didn't just affect it in heavy rain. Also, if you're shooting in a cold evening, for example, early in the morning, and you breathe on the viewfinder, then that can cause it to mist up all of a sudden again, and that was very annoying. I did get used to kind of holding my hand over the viewfinder to warm it up and get rid of the condensation that way, but it was just seemed like an unnecessary problem. Now, I haven't been shooting with the new camera enough to find out whether they've really and truly solved that altogether, but if they have, again, that would be an amazing, that would be a great improvement from my perspective, because that did used to bother me on the EM1 Mark III. So moving across, we have this lever here, this lever switch. Now, on the EM1 Mark III, the lever is bigger, but it's in a slightly harder position to access. It's a bit counterintuitive because the lever is actually on the other side than what it should be, to my mind. And they've rectified that on the OM1 Mark II. So the lever here is smaller. I don't know whether it's going to be harder to actually operate with gloves on. It's a bit less, as I say, it's smaller, so arguably it could be harder to find with your thumb, but actually it's in a much more convenient position. So again, I think that's an improvement, and almost, you know, one step forward, maybe 1.1 step back. Something that is a very definite improvement as well is they've got a separate AF on button from the AEL button. So I have two modes that I shoot in generally. For portraits, I'll just be using the shutter for focus. For wildlife, landscape, etc., I use back button focus. So having a separate AF on button is great, big improvement. I've not mapped AEL to anything so far, but here, yeah, let's just show you the difference. It's the EM1 Mark III, just one button for AEL and AFL, whereas you have separate buttons now on the OM1 Mark II. Big improvement. That's great. Joystick feels very similar. Autofocus joystick feels very similar. They've made some changes on the OM1 Mark II, which are making it take a bit of time for me to get used to. I mean, maybe this is the time now to talk about autofocus. One of the main reasons I got the OM1 Mark II, having used the EM1 Mark III for 5 years, and I should say I had this and used it partly for sentimental reasons, and I was reluctant to upgrade when the OM1 Mark I came up. It's recently that I've started doing a bit more bird photography, and that is one of the things that's kind of piqued my interest in the OM1 Mark II because of the improvements for that kind of photography and macro as well. And my initial verdict is, having used it for portraits particularly, the eye and human detect on the OM1 Mark II is a big step up from the EM1 Mark III. I used to take a lot of portraits of my children with the EM1 Mark III, and I would have to cull a lot of images where it didn't quite nail focus. Quite often I'd be shooting, and generally one of my favourite lenses that I'd be shooting with is this 25mm 1.2 Pro lens, which is great, gives wonderful pictures. But because it's 1.2, it's quite a narrow depth of field, and that doesn't make it easy for the camera. Now, I've only done one kind of portrait session so far on the OM1 Mark II, but my initial impression is that it was much, much better at finding the eye and focusing and maintaining focus on the eye when my kids are moving around, etc. It just makes it, it's going to make it a lot more painless getting photos in that way. So that is the kind of, for human detection, it's a big step forward. In terms of the autofocus itself, I think it's going to take me a while to get to grips with it, because there are things that I like about it. As I say, I think it's more accurate, it's quicker, it's snappier. But there's things about the OM1 Mark III autofocus that I think were better. So to give you an example, if you're in magnify view with the EM1 Mark III and you're using an old lens like this adapted Sigma 150 lens, even in magnify view, it would still focus, autofocus. So that is very useful for macro, because you use magnify view to look into the, zoom into the insect's eye or whatever it is you're focusing on, and you can still use back button focus to refine the focus so you can see when you've actually when you've nailed the focus. Now, there is a setting in the OM1 Mark II to allow focusing or auto-focusing with magnify view on, and I've selected it, but for some reason it won't work with my adapted Sigma lens. It will work with my Olympus macro lens, which is fine, but I don't like the fact they've actually removed some functionality in the OM1 Mark II. If they just made the improvements and not taken anything away, then this would be 100% a better camera. But there's things like that which are just annoying, because I did use that quite a lot. I did use magnify view and autofocus with one of my favorite lenses, and they seem to have taken that ability away from me for no good reason that I can see. Another thing that's going to take me a while to get to grips with is the way I used to shoot portraits with the OM1 Mark, EM1 Mark III, is I'd have a small autofocus point in the middle of the viewfinder, and I'd have eye detect on. So I could use autofocus with the autofocus spot by moving it around, but also the camera would be scanning the whole frame to detect eyes, and if it detected an eye, it would put a green box around it, even if your focus point is over here. So it would detect the eye over here, and then when you focus, it would focus on the eye, notwithstanding that the focus point is over here, which is very good and very convenient, because it means you can be focusing, or you can let the camera focus for you. And I got used to using that, and that is the kind of way now I think about when I'm shooting portraits. The OM1 Mark II is different. If you wanted to do that, you would, if you wanted to have the camera scanning the whole scene for eyes, for human eyes, I think you'd have to change from the focus point here to having all the focus points, so i.e. the whole viewfinder essentially being scanned. But then you don't have any control really over what the camera is focusing on. It's a different approach. So because whatever box you use for autofocus, I think it's only scanning inside the box. So if I have I think what I'm using at the moment is a kind of small box in the middle. Now if I want to get the focus lock on the eyes, I have to move the camera over here, or the focus box over here, and then it will start to track the eyes, but it doesn't pick them up automatically unless they're in the box, which is a different approach. And at the moment, I think I prefer the old approach, albeit the focus is much more reliable from what I can see in the OM1 Mark II. So yeah, that's just something I'm going to have to get used to and try and find the best way for me to get that kind of autofocus for people. As I say, this is early days, this is my kind of first impressions, and the autofocus system is quite deep on the OM1 Mark II. It's going to take me a while to get my head around it. So the rest of the buttons, these OK buttons, this D-pad, info, delete and play, They're pretty much identical to the EM1 Mark III, so I'm not going to say anything about that. ISO button, it's a bit smaller. It's not a button I used a huge amount. So again, I'd say all of the buttons, they feel very similar. I mean, there are differences, but I don't know whether that's me having used these buttons and springs for 5 years, so I couldn't really comment on that. What I can comment on though is something that struck me as soon as I picked the camera up. So the OM1 Mark II has a thicker grip than the EM1 Mark III. It's fine, it's still comfortable. These front buttons are in a similar position, so that didn't mess me up. But something that does strike me is that when you're holding it, it has a deeper thumb grip, which in some ways you might think is great because it makes the camera more secure. It's less likely to fall out of your hand. I mean, I will say that the EM1 Mark III camera, I've never dropped it and it's never felt unsecure. You know, you can almost hang it off your fingers, but it's just got this, it's not a huge thumb grip at the back there, but it's enough, makes it very secure there. And the other thing is that the material, and it just feels very sturdy here. You know, this camera feels like it's got some kind of covering on it, but it feels very solid, very metallic in your hand. Now, in the OM1 Mark II, they've made the thumb grip deeper. So let's see if I can show you the comparison there. I mean, it's a subtle thing, but as I say, when you've used the camera this much, millimeters make a big difference. So they've made the thumb grip deeper, which you might think is great, but the way they've done it is using the SD card slot door. So I'm going to pop this out, and you see, like on the EM1 Mark III, it's kind of some kind of plastic material, which is fine. But your thumb, if you're using the extended thumb grip, you are essentially resting on this plastic material rather than on the solid body. Whereas on the EM1 Mark III, although the card slot cover is there, it doesn't feel like you're interacting with it when you're holding the camera. You're just holding the solid body. So that's one of the things that gives the EM1 Mark III a more solid feel to me than the OM1 Mark II. I've not read of anyone having any problems with the SD card door coming off or being damaged or anything, but it is a slight issue because the EM5 Mark III, which I'm filming with, it has a little thumb grip and the material on the thumb grip has come off, and that is an issue that affects a lot of people with this camera, which is not great. I mean, it's something you have to glue back down, I think. And before the EM5 Mark III, I had a EM10, the original one, which was a great little camera. But again, there, the thumb grip actually snapped off after I'd had it for about 10 years or so. As I say, I've never had any issue with the thumb grip on the EM1 Mark III. Hopefully, the OM1 Mark II will be a kind of similar professional level of sturdiness, but it just doesn't feel as secure. If I tap that there, maybe you can pick up the kind of plasticky feel of that bit of the camera compared to that solid bit there. Yeah, I think that sound probably illustrates the difference in feeling. Solid camera, plastic door. So let's talk about the top dial. Quite similar. The EM1 Mark III dial feels a bit more sturdy. It feels, I don't know if it is metal, but it feels more metallic. You've got the kind of knurled metal edge to it. They both have locking pins. They're both great, yeah. And then let's talk about one of the biggest differences actually between the two cameras, which is the dials and the shutter button, which in some ways are the most important things because these are what you interact with most on the camera. Now, the EM1 Mark III, I think, is quite unusual among DSLR style cameras in having the shutter button here in the middle of the front dial. Now, that was the first time I'd had a DSLR like this. I had some old film cameras. Well, in old film cameras, the shutter would be there and there'd be a kind of a ring around it, but in the ones I had, that ring wasn't used for anything. It was more decorative. But here you have the front ring around the shutter button, and that's really great in my view, because there's almost no movement needed between taking the picture and adjusting. It's almost one movement. It's so smooth. So that's one difference between the two. On the OM1 Mark II, they've done something that I think is more typical for DSLR style bodies. They have a separate dial and shutter. So if you want to adjust the dial and take the picture, you know, you can still do it quickly. There's not much distance between them, but it's very definite two movements essentially, rather than the kind of smooth movement that you have on the EM1 Mark III. The other thing is that the back button, the back dial I should say, is now enclosed in this housing. They've got some blank space there, which is a bit odd because every other surface of the camera seems to be covered in buttons and dials. You almost think, well, okay, they've put that dial internal, made it internal now. You could have used that space for something else, but they haven't. Maybe you're supposed to rest your thumb there or something, but yeah, the dials feel okay. They've, I have to say that I think the dial and shutter arrangement on the EM1 Mark III is something that I prefer to the OM1 Mark II. The front buttons, as I've said, very similar. I'm not going to talk about those. So that is a very quick overview of the physical changes. In the hand, the OM1 Mark II does feel good. It feels bigger, as I say, than the EM1 Mark III. If you've got bigger hands, then you probably prefer this. I've got medium-sized hands, so it's kind of a score draw, or I might even prefer the EM1 Mark III. The EM1 Mark III feels more sturdy for the reasons that I've gone into, but in use, I would say the viewfinder in particular makes it so that even though I probably prefer the external feel of the EM1 Mark III, it's going to be very hard for me to go back to using this over the OM1 Mark II. Now, as I say, the image quality from what I've seen is almost identical between the two. There was some talk of a one-stop ISO advantage in these new OM cameras over the EM1 Mark III. I can't see that. I was very, very happy with the image quality of the EM1 Mark III. So if the OM1 Mark II has essentially the same image quality, that is fine. That's great as far as I'm concerned. So this is a very brief overview of my initial impressions, mostly about the physical quality of the camera. I could talk more about the menus, the screen, the battery life, etc. Maybe after I've spent some more time with the camera, I might do that. I might put up some images now comparing the two cameras. I did go out this morning with both cameras and tried to shoot the same scene. It's difficult for me because I don't really use a tripod, so I'll try and line them up as much as possible. But I might put up a few shots now, just showing one against the other. I think in terms of image quality, they're going to be pretty much identical. And there are advantages and disadvantages to each to the user experience, but the screen, the viewfinder on the OM1 Mark II is great. So hopefully you found this video interesting and useful. Please give me a like and a subscribe, and thanks very much for watching. I'll catch you on the next video. Goodbye.